Hello. This video is for Chapter 3, Nonconsequentialist Theories of Morality. In this video, we're going to consider pages 46 through 57 from the reading for this week. This is from the book Ethics, Theory, and Practice by Jacques Thoreau and Kevin Crossman. This reading's available on our course Canvas page. So, an overview for this video. First, I'm going to briefly review what happened last week. And then, we're going to talk about what a non-consequentialist theory of morality is. Then, we're going to look at act non-consequentialism, in particular, Intuitionism. And then, we're going to look at rule non-consequentialism. So here we're going to look at divine command theory and Kant's duty ethics. Then, we're going to consider some general criticisms of non-consequentialist theories. Okay, so last week, we looked at consequentialist moral theories. So you remember that these are theories that consider the consequences of our actions. The two theories we looked at last week are egoism, and this is the view that everyone should always act in his or her own best self-interest, regardless of the interests of others, unless those other people's interests also serve the person that's considering the action. And we also looked at utilitarianism, and this is the view that everyone should perform the act or follow the rule that brings about the greatest good or most happiness for everyone involved. So, what is a non-consequentialist theory? The most important thing to remember when we're discussing this type of theory is that a person who holds this theory does not, and in fact shouldn't, enter into judging whether actions or people are moral or immoral. Remember, it's not about the consequences of the action. Instead, actions are judged solely on whether they are right, and people solely on whether they are good, based on some other standard or standards of morality other than the consequences of their action. So we'll see what this as an effect is, are that they're judged on a set of rules. So, there's two kinds of non-consequentialist theories. There's act versus rule. The act non-consequentialist theory that we're going to consider is called Intuitionism, and the rule non-consequentialist theory is divine command theory and Kant's duty ethics. So we'll begin with act non-consequentialist theories. So, according to an act non-consequentialist theory, there are no general moral rules or theories at all. There's only particular actions, situations, and people, and we can't generalize an ethical theory from this. So we have to approach each situation individually as one of a kind and decide the right action based on each particular situation. So the example of this theory that we're going to look at is Intuitionism. This is the view that if our actions are moral or not follows from our intuitions about those actions. So, support for moral intuitionism comes from considering 4 points. The first is that any well-meaning person seems to have an immediate sense of right and wrong. The second is that human beings had moral ideas and convictions long before philosophers ever studied ethics. The third is that our reasoning about moral matters is usually used to confirm our perceptions or intuitions. So what this means is that it usually is our intuitions that we use to confirm what we think is moral and not. And fourth, our reasoning about moral issues can go wrong, and in the situations where our reasoning does go wrong, we often fall back on our intuitions or our moral insights. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's a number of criticisms of Intuitionism. The first is that intuitions seem to just be hunches or feelings, and they kind of lack scientific and philosophical respectability. The second is that there's no proof that we even have innate or inborn set of moral rules from which our intuitions would follow. The third is that intuitionism is immune to objective criticisms because it applies only to the person possessing the intuition, and these intuitions can differ from one person to the next. The fourth criticism is that humans don't possess moral intuitions. The fourth criticism is that humans who don't possess moral intuitions either don't have an ethics or have to establish their ethics based on some other grounds other than their intuitions. And this is kind of a strange problem. Okay, now we'll move on to rule non-consequentialist theories. These types of theories say that there are rules that are the only basis for our morality, and that consequences of following these rules don't matter at all. So this is basically the difference between consequentialist theories and non-consequentialist theories. And it's following the rules that's moral, not the consequences of our actions from following the rule. Different rule non-consequentialist views differ because of their method for establishing these rules. We'll see this as we go through the two that we're looking at today. The first example we're going to look at is divine command theory. So, under divine command theory, morality is based on the existence of a supernatural being that's all good, who has communicated to humans what they should and should not do in a moral sense. So on this view, to be moral is to follow the rules that this supernatural being provides us with. Now, there are a number of criticisms of divine command theory. One is that you have to be able to prove that God exists in order to have any kind of ethical system. And as we saw in the first part of this class, proving that God exists, even though there's a number of arguments for it, can be tricky because there's objections to each of these arguments. Another criticism of divine command theory is that once you've proven that God exists, you also have to prove that God's trustworthy, meaning that we can follow and trust the rules that he sets down for us. A third criticism is that divine moral rules are not compelling for people who don't believe that God exists. So, if the source of our ethics is divine command, and yet we don't believe that God exists, it seems like then there isn't a source for our ethical system. And a fourth criticism is that even if we do believe that God exists, we need to be sure that we're interpreting his message correctly, right? So there's a variety of different ways that we can interpret the Ten Commandments, for example, and knowing which one of these ways is the right way is obviously very important if the basis of our morality is coming from divine command. Okay, the next theory we'll look at is Kant's duty ethics. So, Kant refers to Immanuel Kant, and he was born in 1724 and died in 1804. And he is really a massive figure in ethics, and one of the views that he presented is what we're going to look at today, his duty ethics. So, it's a little complicated, but he begins with the idea of the good will. And for Kant, the good will is a uniquely human ability to act in accordance with moral rules, laws, or principles, regardless of interests or consequences. Now, the next thing that Kant held was that reason is also very important. In fact, after the good will, reason is the second most important human attribute, and we can set up an absolute moral rules using reason alone. So, Kant held two additional things. The first is that moral rules cannot be self-contradictory. So this is to say, in the same way that a circle cannot be a square, the rules that we set up for ourselves can't contradict themselves. And he also held that moral rules must be universalizable. So this is important. So what he means here is that any rule we set for ourselves has to be able to be applied to every person. So continuing with Kant's duty ethics, he also has this idea of the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative means that we should ask what rule authorizes the act that I'm about to perform. And then we should ask, can this act become a universal rule for all humans to follow? So, for example, why don't I steal from everyone else in order to survive? So, if this is the rule I'm trying to establish, should I steal from everyone in order to survive? Let's look at what happens when we universalize it. All human beings should steal from each other in order to survive. So here we can see this rule that I should steal to survive is not universalizable, because if all humans stole from each other, we couldn't trust anyone and our society wouldn't function. So therefore, this rule that I should steal from everyone in order to survive can't be a rule that our ethics can follow, because it can't be universalized. Another one of Kant's imperatives is what's called the practical imperative. So this is the view that no human should be thought of or treated simply as a means, but always as an end in themselves. So an example of what this means is that the practical imperative rules out using humans for experiments, because in the case of using a human for an experiment, that human is used only as a means to accomplish the goal that the experiment set out, and not as an individually important human, that is to say, an end in themselves. Now, there's a number of criticisms of Kant's duty ethics. The one that we're going to look at today is the problem of conflicting duties. So, we have a duty not to lie, for example, because lying cannot be universalized. So what this means is that I can't lie, because if I tried to universalize the idea of lying, everybody would lie to each other, and we wouldn't be able to trust anyone, and so our society wouldn't function. Okay, so I have a duty not to lie. But what am I supposed to do in a situation where I need to lie in order to save someone else's life? So, for example, it seems like I also have a duty to save people's lives, but what am I supposed to do in a situation where it seems like I need to lie in order to save someone's life? So, imagine if a soldier was at my door, and they wanted to kill someone that was hiding inside my house. It seems like I have a duty not to lie to the soldier at the door, but it seems like I also have a duty to protect the people that are hiding in my house. So Kant doesn't give us a way of establishing which duty we're supposed to follow in the case of conflicting duties. So there are also a number of general criticisms of non-consequentialist theories. The first is, should we really avoid consequences when trying to set up our own moral systems? It seems like the outcomes of our actions is probably something we want to at least keep in mind when we're setting up our moral theory. Another general criticism of non-consequentialist theories is that these theories might be sort of self-contradictory in themselves. So what this means is, are non-consequentialist theories really non-consequentialist? Don't you have to, at some point, while trying to establish what rule you should be following, have to consider what the outcome of your actions are? Isn't that the way that you figure out what a rule even is? And the third criticism is the problem I was pointing to just a moment ago, which is how can we resolve conflicts among rules that all seem to be equally and absolutely binding? So, a summary of what we've covered in this video. We began by reviewing some from last week. Then we considered what is a non-consequentialist theory. Then we looked at an act non-consequentialist theory, namely Intuitionism. Then we looked at two rule non-consequentialist theories, divine command theory and Kant's duty ethics. And we considered some general criticisms of non-consequentialist theories.